Hey guys, this is Hunter Levine, and thanks for listening to the Captain's Collective. Special shout outs to everybody who's been sharing the podcast and sending us feedback. We really appreciate it. It helps us a ton with what we're doing. In today's episode, my dad and I sit down with Nat Ragland, who was one of the pioneering anglers in the Keys in the 60s and 70s, and really just a legend among legends. And in this conversation, we get a chance to talk about some of the innovation that was happening in fishing at that time, what life was like in the Keys during the 70s, and how Flip Pallot gave him his nickname, the Senator. We hope you guys enjoy. These are some great stories. This is the Captain's Collective.
Success is a gift. Excellence is the only thing to strive for.
He tried to eat it. Hit him. You got him. He's on.
Two butt caps off the rods, filled them with tequila. We took a shot and out we went.
There ain't no getting into it after that. You're hooked. It's a bad habit.
And all the time, Flip's he's standing there ready to go for a tarpon. And he turned around, he says, "You talk so much, you're like a senator."
He's out there. All right, we're going to take up the line.
Well, hey, thanks for being on the podcast. It's been fun so far just to sit down and to talk with you about fishing. And a few moments ago, we were talking about how you first entered into guiding down in the Keys in the 60s and 70s. Was it 60s or?
Well, I used to fish all up and down the Keys in the 60s, but I was an angler in those days. I wasn't a guide. I became a guide in 71, and I stayed in it until 2004.
So that's what, 33 years? Is that what you said?
33
Wow.
years, yeah.
And you were telling us you were there when they really first came out with that Hughes Bonefisher.
Well, the Hughes Bonefisher was that was supposed to be the kind of the state of the art in those days. It got supplemented, or as time went on, there was a lot of other boats that were developed that seemed to do better things. The Steve Huff, I'm sure you've heard of. Steve was quite an innovative person. He ran a bonefisher for quite some time, and then he found that he needed something else to do. And so he was driving up the road one day, I guess it was in the lower Key Largo or something, and there was a hull laying on the side of the road. It was just had been discarded. And he got to looking at it, and he said, that hull looks really adaptable. The top of the cap was not a bonefish boat. So he digged around with the guy and bought it for $50. And he took it back, cut a skill saw and cut the whole top of it off. And just used the hull, reinforced it, built hatches in it, built a thing. And that was the first Sidewinder. And he ran that for quite some time, and then I had been a good friend of Steve's and had seen it many times, had fished out of it, and it was a wonderful riding boat. Oh, it was just a wonderful boat. And so that kind of got into that. The graphite boats did come along way after that, and but the Hughes, and there was a boat called a Gettman boat. They were used quite extensively in Alamorada, and they were wood boats. But the Hughes Bonefisher was the first flats boat. And I guess the only claim to fame was the fact that Bob Hughes was the first manufacturer or anything that started the towers, the polling towers. Bill Curtis, who was at that time was a very famous a bonefish guide in Lower Biscayne Bay, said we need something to stand on back there. So he and Bob Hughes got together and they designed this polling tower to go on the stern of the boat. And so Bob had whoever was making the boat, the towers for him, said, I want 4. He was his dealership was an OMC dealer, and he said, I want 4 towers for OMCs and 2 for Mercuries. So one day Bob happened to be, I happened to run into him in the Ferro Blanco marina. He was staying there, and he had come down. He used to have fish out of Big Pine Key, fun fish. And he had this bonefisher with a tower on the back of it. He said, Nat, come on, he's out here and see what I got here. See if you like that thing. Well, this was he was on the trailer. So I looked at it. And in those days, we used to pole the boat from the bow. Everybody poled from the bow. We pushed the boat stern first. And so I got up in the trailer and got up in the boat and stood up on the thing. Well, it was about 15 feet high, I thought, Seemed like it was that high. I said, man, I want one of these things. So Bob says, well, I had just happened to have one, he says. So I was, as best I can remember, I was the first guide in the Keys, to have a polling tower. And then it was Katie barred the door. Everybody got them after that. Yeah.
And you were saying back in the Keys earlier today, there's only really a handful of guys who were guiding down there. A lot of the attention was more northern than that.
Well, the supposed fishing capital of the world was in Islamorada. And most all the anglers and everybody that was fishing, and all the publicity was going into the Islamorada area. And the lower Keys, we were just kind of Johnny-come-latelys, We had some of the best fishing you ever saw, and there was nobody there but us. Nobody, none of the locals that weren't guides never fished where we were fishing. All the flats were open. I mean, it was lonely. You'd go to Marquesas, and if you saw another boat, you said, man, I'm glad somebody else is out here with me. And I was talking to one of my friends just the other day. He said he had made a trip to Marquesas and counted 32 boats there.
That's crazy.
And who all was down there at that time, that network? Who was all kind of hanging out?
In the lower Keys, well, Harry Snow Jr. and Cal Cochran, Joe Saladino, Roy Lowe. He had a brother that was also a guide. These were just in the marathon people. I can't even remember all the ones in Islamorada. Albright and Jack Brothers and some of the old names, the really big names in flat fishing ran out of Islamorada.
And what was that community like? What were the relationships like? Because it sounds like in a really innovative time, and you mentioned that with the pulling platforms, but a time when people were learning with each other. And
Islamorada was more fishing oriented as far as the motels and eateries, and they supported their guides quite heavily. Because there were so few of us in Marathon, we more or less became a kind of a town, I mean, it wasn't oriented towards sports fishing. There was a lot of sports fishing going on there, offshore as well as onshore, but it didn't have the publicity that Islamorada did.
And you guys were talking earlier about some of the tackle you guys would use.
Well, the biggest advance that ever occurred in flats fishing was polarized glasses. Everybody had been fishing prior to polarized glasses. They didn't have the visibility that polarized glasses gave everybody. consequently, most of the guides in those days depended on spots. They said, watch that spot, and sometime a fish will come in there. They couldn't see the fish come to that spot, but they usually they anchored over a white area or something, and then you would see a shadow come across it. And, well, there he is, and like I say, you cast right to that spot. You might have your angler say, okay, make 15 shots at that spot, just so that you know where that's. And when I tell you to throw in that spot. And that's the way we used to fish in those days. But polarized glasses said, hey, here he comes, at 3 o'clock at 60 feet, we had a whole new thing. The first polarized glasses I used were tanker glasses that were made from World War II that they used to issue to the tankers in North Africa. And we used to buy them at the Army Navy salvage stores for 10 cents a piece. I used to buy them in lots of 20, okay, and because they didn't hold together very good and everything, and they gave out after a while. But the first ones, I in fact, somewhere in my thicket, I think I still got one of those things left, There were all adjustable earpieces and everything, and they were just you see copies of them out around now. They're for $60, but in those days they were 10 cents a piece.
And when you think back to that time, just back in the 60s and 70s in the Keys, and you have some of the big names that we talk about today and think about today, everyone's down there networking and helping each other out. And I mean, what do you miss the most about those days?
Well, there was always a certain amount of camaraderie that you first off developed with your clientele. Among the guides, there were all kinds of relationships. Some were good, some were not so good, some were casual, some were deep. As far as I know, I've got friends right to this day that are, some of them are still in the business, some of them are retired, and regretfully, some of them are gone.
And when you look at kind of how those relationships formed and how they functioned, was there a lot of mentoring going on? I know you mentioned some guys in the Miami Fishing Club investing in you.
Oh, in the fishing club, we were all mentors. The ones that, the new members that came in the club were always taken over by some of the older members and taught how to tie the knots, where to go if they had their own boat, or if invited it to go with you and learn how to fish the way we were fishing in those days. I remember we used to do a lot of deep jigging offshore with 10-pound test line, and spinning reels that they would carry quite a lot of line. It wasn't necessarily that we needed that much line, but because the spools needed the diameter increased, so the retrieve rate was faster. And we used to put on demonstrations about taking a 5-pound block of lead and trying to lift it off the ground with a 10-pound test line. And these boys would, it's very hard to lift 5 pounds off the line with a 10-pound line test. I don't know whether you've ever tried it yourself, but if you really think about it, take a 8-foot rod or a 7.5-foot rod and try to lift 5 pounds off the ground with it. It's very difficult. That's why they say, well, you catch 50, 60-pound fish with 10-pound test line. Oh yeah, but you don't do it right away. You let him tire out a white.
Now, when you were guiding, when you went down and you started guiding, did you stay involved with the Miami Fish Club?
I did As a kind of a member, I didn't usually go to any of their functions or anything. I stayed in contact with some of the people that were there, but basically I quit fishing that way. The Sports Fishing Club was pretty much oriented to the offshore stuff, the reef fishing and everything. There was a lot of us did the flats work too, but that was kind of a peripheral. They did, that wasn't the big orient in those days. I guess the one that I always called him part fish was Norman Duncan. I don't know, Norman's still in Miami. I don't think he fishes much anymore, but he used to take a species of fish, or it could have been anything. Say, I'm going to learn how to catch that fish. And he would concentrate all his fishing effort on that one fish, whatever species it might happen to be. One day it was a kingfish, one day it was a permit, one day it was a bonefish, one day it was a sailfish. And when he learned how to catch it, he went on to the next one. And I remember when nobody had caught any permit prior to a couple of accidents. Chuck Walton had caught a permit fishing out of Marathon, of all places, and set a record on fly fishing in those days. And Norman says, I'm going to learn how to catch a permit on fly. And everywhere he went, he was rigged for a fly rod and what he called a permit fly. He didn't show it to anybody, but one day he caught 2 in the same day. Gave up permit fishing, didn't do it anymore. But he said, I know how to do it now.
Now that's something. You caught a big permit, didn't you?
I caught a big permit, but I caught him on a bait casting rod. We were fishing a fellow that had an Ambassador 6,000 reel. We were fishing the Marquesas, and I had a friend of mine who I'd known from high school was fishing with us that day, and this other fella, and we were pulling an area in the Marquesas where you'd see a lot of tarpon and a lot of permit. And I said, okay, in those days, crabs were very hard to come by. You had to catch them yourself. You couldn't go to the tackle store and buy them. You had to get them yourself. And my high school chum had never caught a tarpon, so I said, "Well, I'm going to rig you with a big crab, and for the tarpon size, and what little I had was so." This other fellow, he wanted to use the bait casting rod. Well, I needed a little weight there. I couldn't just, so I gave him a little bigger crab than I would normally use. We were pulling down the flat, and here come a fish. And I said, okay, tarpon man, get up there, and here he comes, So he gets up and makes the cast. Well, he was closer to the fish before he cast, okay. So in the meantime, the fish got up close enough to recognize it was a really large permit. So I said to the permit guy, I said, cast to the permit, So he made a cast, and he missed him just almost as far as the tarpon man had missed him. Well, they both cranked in real quick, and the permit man cast. The fish came right over, ate the cry. 70 minutes later, we got a all tackle world record permit on 15-pound test line. It's still a record. Still a 20-pound record.
And what did that fish weigh?
50 pounds, 8 ounces.
Wow.
And that was in the 70s, you said?
That was just before I guided. I had already became a guide, but it was before I had moved to the Keys. And I already had my license and everything. I was in the summer of 70. 1970.
Very good.
I know a big part of your story was somebody who kind of said, you shared this earlier, and I'd love for you to share it again so we could have it on the podcast, but somebody who took you when you were working in the movie industry and you weren't very happy and you were in a car and guide that you had fished with that day kind of said, "Hey, would you be interested in doing this? I got a second boat." Could you kind of share that story about how you got involved down there? And
Well, at the end of the fishing club there, my friend Bob Stearns, he said, "Come on, go with me fishing." He said, "We're going down the Keys and fish with this captain in Marathon, and then we were going to go on down and fish the second day in Key West." So we got up the next morning and drove down to Key West and went fishing with this guide. He was just kind of going along for the publicity, and Bob was writing for the magazines in those days. So he was wanting to get a story about catching baby tarpon under the mangroves with a fly rod. So Captain Cal, who was with us that day, he said, "Well, I know some spots where we can go do that with." So they wanted me to do the casting. Bob was going to take the pictures, and Cal was going to kind of like be the guide. So he took us down. We caught 3 or 4 little baby tarpon under the flies with a fly rod, and that was my first article that got written up and published in Saltwater Sportsman or something like that. And Bob wrote it, and had me pictures of casting into the thing, a little tarpon and everything. In the meantime, on the second day, we had invited Cal to come on down and fish with us to go to Key West. So we went down, we fished Key West, and we fished permit and tarpon, and I forget we caught anything that day. And on the way back, Cal said to me, he said, "Would you be interested in come on ride with me and back to Marathon in my car?" So on the way back, he proposed that I come down and move to Marathon and run his second boat for him. And that's how I actually got into. I was going to hang my shingle out, and my first shingle was going to be in Key West. I was going to run from Key West. And he kind of talked me out of it and started in Marathon.
And that's one of the things when we were talking with Jimmy Long and Homosassa, and he talked about the way that you mentored him and helped him. And then we talked to you and hear about these guys in the Miami Fish Club and Cal and different people who invested into you. And I'm sure the lineage goes on and on and on. But when you think about mentoring in the fishing community, what makes somebody a great mentor?
Well, you got to like people, one thing, and my feeling about it was that some of the up and coming guides who wanted to be guides or were just fishermen were doing it the wrong way, or getting into it in a way that wasn't very productive. So I decided that, especially when I was in the fishing club, that used to be my job. I used to take all the young, new aspirant members with me on my boat, and I would show them as much as I knew in those days. And the equipment was just then starting to get really, really good. Prior to that time, there had been a lot of fly fishing, and we hadn't really talked about fly fishing yet, but the fly fishing business was just starting to orient towards the saltwater end of it. Before it had all been freshwater, trout being and a certain amount of salmon, but all the equipment being manufactured and put out, Orvis being one, were put out some very fine rods and everything, but they were oriented towards saltwater, freshwater fishing, and all of us guides that were starting to orient or start to target big tarpon said, we need equipment that can land one of these things. We can hook him on a 3-weight rod, but you can't land him. And so Leon Martus, who was then owner of Scientific Angler, who was also a good friend of Lefty Craze, and Lefty and Leon got together and put their heads together, and they came out with a whole series of saltwater-oriented fly rods. And I remember one day, Bob Stearns and I went over. Lefty was then one of the directors of the Metropolitan Fishing Tournament, and they had offices at the Miami Herald, which was on the Biscayne Bay. And we went over to talk to him one day, and he said, I just got a whole load of rods in from Leon, from Scientific Angler. He says, I haven't tried them all. He says, let's go out and throw them out. So we went out on the back thing of the Miami Herald thing, and we were testing these rods. And I thought, and I had already built my own fly rod, and I was doing pretty good with it. Anyway, Lefty was a tremendous caster. I mean, he was, and he would pick up a rod and he would cast it a few times, and he wouldn't try to get distance. He would just get the head of the line off and work it a few times, and then he'd turn to Bob and says, well, I think we need to take about 2 inches off the end of this rod, Well, I had no idea what they were talking about. So finally I said, Lefty, I said, you want to try my rod? He says, I said, I built this rod myself. I've been catching all these fish with it. He says, this is my rod. He said, so he got up my rod, and he cast it a few times. He said, Nat, he said, that's the worst rod I have ever seen in my life.
Oh, man.
So anyway, then we started getting the really good equipment in. And in those days, there were only 2 reels. I mean, the Fenor wedding cake reel and the the salt Seamasters. The guy that developed the wedding cakes, according to the story goes, it was Gar Wood, who was a race boat driver, had got with Fenor and stood. And these were made both in the States. That was before the Japanese bought Fenor out. And the Seamaster reels were made there in Coral Gables. And in those days, they were really tough. I mean, you get a Seamaster, man, that was you were top line. And we used to save for days getting a Seamaster because they cost $50 a piece. And you only had to get one. I mean, in fact, I think I got my first Seamaster. I bought it secondhand, and I didn't tell my wife for a couple of years I had one.
You had it hidden in somebody else's garage and all that, or you're just trying to hide it away from her?
Oh, no, she's not fish oriented. I don't know whether that's a good or a plus, but she raised the kids. I did the fishing.
and so all the saltwater fly fishing is picking up, and you're doing a lot in the Homosassa area. And
I hadn't got to Homosassa yet. I was not one of the first ones to go to Homosassa. First one to go to Homosassa was a guy from Clearwater, and he and his boys used to go there every tarpon season, and they were plug fishermen. They used to fish bait casting reels and plugs, and that was Harold the Master, who had invented the mirror line lures, and he lived in Clearwater. And my friend, I keep mentioning Bob Stearns, Bob lived in Largo, Florida, which was a subsidiary of Clearwater. And Bob and I went to Homosassa the first time in about 55, I guess. The first time I fished Homosassa was in 55. And we were just went down out of school. We were both going to school at Florida State at that time. And he said, my friend Harold the Master said, there's some big tarpon here in Homosassa. Well, we went down there where the tarpon was gone in those days. They had been there and had migrated out. We didn't do any good. We caught some redfish and things. But I remember him saying, this is the place to be. in the late, I guess it was the early 70s or late 60s. Steve Huff had heard the same story I had heard about the big tarpon at Homosassa, and he had an angler who used to come down. He was a member of the New York Stock Exchange and quite affluent. And he said, "Let's go over to Homosassa and fish one time." So all of us who were then very hard into the tarpon season and marathon, we didn't have time to go over to Homosassa and go fishing. So Steve and Tom Evans came over blind, just picked up, trailered over here. They didn't know anybody or anybody. And they just went down and started fishing in Homosassa. Run out the river and kind of went on down to the south at Chattanooga Point and on down into the White Sands and everything. And they started finding these things down there. And I remember talking to Tom Evans years later, and I don't know, Steve was never one to beat his drum. If you ask him how he did it, he says, "Oh, he caught a couple." He might have jumped 15, but he caught a couple. he never bragged about it. But he said, Tom said, "Well," he said, "I remember one morning we went out of Homosassa. So we went down below, and he said, at 10 o'clock I had landed my 7th big tarpon on fly."
Wow.
And he said, "I was dead." He said, "I was a basket case." He said, "Come on, Steve, let's go home." Steve says, "You can't go." He said, "I'm counting 20 schools around us within sight right now. 20 schools." They left. That was how good it was when it was really good. That was in about 69 or 70 probably. My first trip to the Keys was in 75. I mean, to Homosassa was to 75.
And how did you end up getting more involved there as things
Well,
unwound?
I had one of my first big tarpon anglers who was I fished while I was still partners with this other guide, was a law attorney. He was a law professor. He actually taught law at one of the North Carolina universities, either Chapel Hill or the other one, I don't know what. Anyway, he had come down and fished with another guide at Homosassa the year before, and he kept after me. He says, "You got to go to Homosassa. You got to come with. I want you to come over and guide me in Homosassa." So kind of reluctantly, I said, "Oh, okay." He goes, I didn't have any clientele set up to fish Homosassa other than him, and I wasn't going to come for just a week or so. So we came over to Homosassa, and I got into the tarpon business, and I thought, this is a really great thing here, And so I started getting more clientele oriented towards making the tarpon run time at Homosassa. And so from 75, I fished Homosassa 13 or 14 years in a row. We used to come always the first weekend, first almost full week of May, and stayed the full just after Labor Day. I mean, just after Memorial Day. But I had to get back to the Keys because I was involved in a lot of the tournaments in those Keys, which happened in June, so I couldn't stay past about Memorial Day. And then in those days, it was 5 or 6 of the Keys guides that were coming to Homosassa. They were really oriented to that kind of. Steve was one, and Lee Baker was one, Dale Perez, and later on, even Harry came over. Harry Spear came over. But that was later. That was later on, and it was a big happening. I used to remember, thought, oh, I'm glad I'm going to Homosassa, man. I couldn't hardly get out of town fast enough. And then when I get over here, after about 4 weeks of pulling for those suckers, I'd say, man, I've got to get back to Keys so we can stake out again, you know.
That's interesting that you mentioned that your tarpon run in the Keys started a little earlier than Homosassa.
The tarpon run in the Keys started we started really targeting them in March.
And then y'all staked in the Keys, but when you went to Homosassa, you actually poled. That's kind of more the traditional way of doing it in Homosassa around the point.
The original way, and I remember this is the first electric motors were just starting to take whack. Because of the sea conditions in the afternoon at Homosassa, you really need electric motors if you're pulling for them. Most our orientation in those days, we would usually go in the mornings and fish black rock, which is naturally you don't see them quite as you see them visually on the surface, but you don't really see them down in the water that much. At about 10 o'clock in the morning, in those days, in the early days, a lot of the black rock fish would get up and they would start going south. Well, in those days there was a rack, one of the old net racks, and that's where we used to, all of us would, about 10 o'clock, we'd all start orienting towards the rack. Well, the water got shallower there, and you could actually start to see the schools coming at you. Now, they weren't fast moving in those days. They were just kind of swimming along, see one roll here, one roll there, and you could pole with them. I mean, you could stay with them if they weren't fast movers. You'd have fast movers, but most of them were just kind of slow coming on down. Well, you would position your boat and get your shots out, and then later on, as the sun got up big, higher, and everything, we'd go down in the white sands between there and off of Pine Island. And there was a track these things used to hack. It wasn't a close track, it was a wide track. So you had to move your boat in and out, in and out, in and out to stay with us. You might see a school come by, 100 yards inside of you, and you might see a school, the same thing, 100 yards outside of you. So you had to pole for them to get your shots. Well, naturally say, it's easier to see them on the white sands than it is anywhere else. And so most all of the guides, not everybody, but most all of the guides would wind up off in the white sands in the afternoons. And being the fact that the lion's share of the fish had left Black Rock by the afternoons, nobody fished the Black Rock country in the afternoons. So the Homosassa people that were actually got into the tarpon season was Jimmy's uncle, Alex Williams. And Alex was an old time guide in Homosassa, and he and his brother had been on the river for 40 years then. Well, Alex was smart enough that he saw that there was quite a business to be had fishing for tarpon. Usually, they were all trout and redfish people, fishing in big boats and spinning tackle and everything. Well, Alex said, man, this is the best thing that ever happened to Homosassa, is the publicity of the people coming to fish big tarpon and fly. So he developed a flats boat. In fact, I think he was using a Maverick in those days. And he started guiding parties and things. Well, I always looked up to Alex. I said, you've been here a lot longer than I have. And I said, where are they? He said, you know more about it, Nat, than I do. He says, I never fished these things until 2 years ago. So anyway, as time went on, he introduced me to some of the other Homosassa people. There wasn't very many fishing, and it was doing. Jimmy Long came along. I don't remember exactly the time, but I remember he ran out of the old Tradewinds motel area with Alex, and Alex introduced me. He said, this is my nephew, Jimmy Long. He's just getting into business, and if you can show him any pointers, do it. So I said, come on up to the room. Well, in those days, as soon as I hit Homosassa, I took all the feathers that I used to bring up and put them out on the kitchen table, and we tie flies. When we weren't fishing, we were tying flies, and we had all kinds of different flies. And so I took Jimmy. I said, look, this is the way you do it. This is the way you tie a fly. And I said, this is the way that's the way I rig them. I said, there's a whole bunch of ways to rig flies, but I said, this is the way I rig them. You can either use it or use somebody else's. I don't care, but this is the way I do it. And so Jimmy, he was right there. He wanted to do it, and he was always there in the afternoons when we'd come in. I'd come up the room. We'd all have a beer or healing beaker, and we used to call in those days. And he didn't have those things, but I used to have healing beakers. Okay. Anyway, Jimmy, he was right there. And we'd talk on the radio, and we fished a few times. Have a day off, you have a cancellation or something like that. I'd say, come on, Jimmy, let's go down the river. And we caught some fish. We hooked some fish.
Let me ask you, how did they feel? What was that sentiment of the local guides when the Keys guys showed up?
About the only friends we had was Alex Williams and his son, Bruce, and there was another boy, Hampton. I can't remember his first name. And Hammer Locklear. Hammer wasn't a guide when I first started. He was just a dock hand at McRae's, and he finally got in, hung out his shingle. I used to talk more to his father, Eustace Locklear. Eustace was a commercial fisherman for all intent and purposes, and we used to eat at one of the old breakfast nooks in Homosassa in those days. It was called Smitty's. And my roommate, who was a guide from Marathon, and a good friend of mine, Mike Hewlett, we used to eat breakfast there. And Eustace used to eat breakfast. Well, we were all sat around the table and talk fish. And Eustace said, well, I know they were going to be here or they're going to be there. They never were, but he always told us where we were supposed to go. And so most of the Alamorada Guides Association, with the exception of Alex and Jimmy, and in later years, Hammer and this Hampton boy, they all adapted the way we were fishing. But the old time guides in Homosassa, they didn't think we were doing the right thing.
Now, I've heard you called the Senator. How did you get that nickname?
Well, when the first Gold Cup tarpon tournament I fished in the Keys, and that was in, I got to say it was in the late 70s or something. you got to remember that in those days, Almirada was a closed shop. You just didn't come in and hang out your shingle. You had to pretty much, give your firstborn son to the Guides Association, or daughter, as the case may be, and anyway. They had some bad situations where an angler would come in and make application to one of the tournaments, and the whole idea was that the tournaments were designed to promote the guides of Alamorada. Well, some of the anglers said, I want my guide. I'm not going to hire one of the Alamorada guys. Well, some of the times they even wrote it into the bylaws that they had to be so many, so long in the Keys. And anyway, the first break in the whole system was when this Steve Huff I mentioned before and his angler Tom, they decided to fish the Gold Cup. So he came up and kind of broke the first man on the sidewalk, so to speak. And so the next year, one of my old fishing club members, I'm sure you've heard of him, Flip Pallot, Flip said, Nat, would you guide me in the Gold Cup? And I said, well, I'm not really oriented to fish the Alamorada country. He said, well, I know a lot of the spots and everything, and he was a big Alamorada angler, not as a guide, but as an angler. And he said, I can show you some of the spots and everything. Well, I knew a lot of the spots in the Lower Keys, and there wasn't that far a run. So I said, sure, I'll do it if the Alamorada people will let me. So he made application and got accepted. He said, my guide's going to be Nat Ragland. Well, there was a big stink going on. And some of the Alamorada guides were kind of looked down on you when you were. But I remember one of the old timers, Jack Brothers, who was one of the old time Alamorada guides. On the kickoff banquet, he came up to me and he said, Nat, he said, I'm really glad to hear you come up here. He said, it's really a pleasure to have some new faces. Well, he was as friendly as any Alamorada guides. It took about 6 years before they all started talking to you. Anyway, Flip and I went out, and in those days we did a lot of stakeout spots. Well, the year that we did the first Gold Cup, we had a little depression form on top of us, and we used to leave the dock with 2 raincoats on because it was raining so bad. One wouldn't do the trick. You had to put 2 on, okay? And we get out to these stakeout spots. And in those days, some of the fish, even in the grass in the backcountry of the Alamorada, where it's notoriously hard to see them, they all come so slow and easy and everything, just frolicking on the surface and everything. And the fin's out, and they just swim along and everything. And the damn things ate. I mean, you just get a fly out there, and we all used orange and whites and bright-looking things. Those tarpon had never seen something like that. They just pounced on it. I mean, you get an orange and yellow fly in front of one of those fish, he'd eat it right now. If you just got the fly to the school, somebody would eat it. I mean, you knew that you were going to get a hookup. You not keep him on all the time. He might jump off or break off or whatever, but you had a pretty good chance of having a hookup. Well, needless to say, in all this pouring down rain and everything, Flip was Flip was standing on the bow, and I was on the back. In those days, we were still pulling from the bow. And Flip used to take and ride on the motor. He would stand. He had a piece of carpet he put on top of the motor and stand on top of the motor for a tower. And needless to say, there were times in between when the tarpon weren't coming. Well, I used to just, for lack of anything to do, we just started telling stories. I would just make them up. There was no thing. I remember one I told Flip. I said about how the electric motors got developed. That they came from twin brothers from the Netherlands, and it went into all this, and I named them and everything. Actually, the first electric motors were developed by the Herschel clock people, the big names eventually took them over, but the first electric motors were made by Herschel clock, and so I made up these two fictitious Herschel brothers that developed these electric motors. And I went on and on and on and on, and I told them, I named them Piter and all different kinds of names, and I would tell stories about them, and all the time Flip's he's standing there ready to go for a tarpon, and he turned around, he says, "You talk so much, you're like a senator." And ever since that day, he every time I see him, he always calls me Senator.
So Flip Pallot gave you the nickname Senator.
Flip Pallot gave me the nickname.
That's
Senator.
awesome.
Yeah.
One of the things I wanted to do too is just hearing all these stories about that time back then, and some of these names of people that continually, as we interview and talk with different guides, it doesn't matter if they're in their 20s or 30s or 60s, 70s, 80s, have made such an impression on the fishing community. I mean, when you were getting into guiding and you were in the peak of guiding, what were some of the things that were really important for you as a guide?
Well, as I understand guiding, and the way I always approached it, that we were entertainment directors. These anglers would come down. They were, in most cases, had to be affluent to go with the rates that were going, even the early rates. They spent a lot of money coming to South Florida and the Keys. Motels, transportation, eats, drinks, guide fees, equipment if they brought their own. And first off, they were getting away from whatever their business was. Very few of them I always made a habit never to talk about somebody. I didn't ask doctor questions. I didn't ask attorney questions. That was the last thing they wanted to talk about. And there's a story about that too. But anyway, my feeling was we were entertainment directors. And as such, I always approach my people and said, I want you to go out and have the best damn time you can possibly have. If the fish come and eat, and I couldn't promise them that everyone was going to eat, but I said, at least we're going to try like the devil to get them to eat. And you're going to have a good time doing it. And that's the way I approached all my customers. I said, once in a while, and I'll remember in 33 years that I fished, I had 3 people that I never wanted to see again. Out of all those people that I had that fished with me and everything, there was only 3 that I never did. They didn't know it. They called me up and wanted to go fishing, but I just wasn't available for them. Their attitude was such that they weren't compatible with me, but they didn't know it. They never knew it, and I saw many of them afterwards on the dock, and we had good relations, but they just never got in my boat again.
When I sat down with Harry, he was the first person to actually sit down for the podcast, and he's near where we're based out of. And he was talking about tournament fishing, but he was talking about it's true for guiding too. And he says, it's kind of like a big pizza pie. And being a great guide, there's all these different slices, and there's some big slices and there's little slices. And he was talking about, he felt like a lot of times what made good anglers, the difference between good anglers and great anglers, or good captains and great captains, was a lot of time those small little slices, the small extra things that people would do. I mean, what are some of those things when you look back at when you were guiding that you were really emphatic on doing? And you talked about being an entertainment director, but were there other things too that you were really focused on?
At the same time, in any type of fishing, there's times between fish, and those times have to be addressed in some factor. I always, and I guess that's part of the thing why I became called the senator, was the fact that I used to entertain my people, and I guess I just had a kind of a raconteur basis, and I would just make up stories that go along, and I remember one, and this is getting away from you just a little bit, but a man and his woman, I don't remember their names now. A lot of times the angler would come with his wife. She was not an angler, had no interest in angling, but she wanted to go along on the trip. Well, the angler would get up on the bow and be ready to do what he was doing. Well, the poor lady would sit in the chair or on the bench or on the hatch or however, and for hours and hours and hours, and with nothing to do, nothing to see, nothing other than the flat aura itself. And this couple, we were pulling up to one of the islands in the Lower Keys, not too far from the contents, and it was a frigate bird rookery, and the frigate birds used to roost on the mangroves and everything, and you could pull up, I guess within 100 yards of the island before they really got nervous enough to start to fly. So as you pulled up to the island, there was no birds flying at all, except an occasional seagull or something. But when you got up to the island, all of these frigate birds used to launch at the same time. Well, I mean, there was lots of frigate birds. So I hadn't paid any attention to it. Well, this poor lady was sitting there, bored to death, I'm sure. And as we pulled up, I was trying to, it was at one of the tarpon spots, and I hadn't seen any tarpon at the time. So I hadn't paid any attention to the fact that, I knew the frigate birds were going to do this, but all of a sudden all these birds launched at the same time, and I remember said, "Oh my God!" I said, "Look at the saltwater bats." And I don't know whether you've ever seen frigate birds. I said, "Look at the saltwater bats." I said, "They're vicious things. They'll come down and get in your hair." I said, "If you see any of them falling on you, coming down to you, tell me about it, and I'll hit them with a push pole." Well, this woman turned white as a sheet, and her husband was standing on the bow, and he knew what happened. And he was dying laughing, but he didn't want to turn around and look at her. Well, she never took her eyes off the sky the rest of the day and everything. I got to feeling so bad about it, and it was just a spur of the moment. I called them saltwater bats, and poor thing, she was.
But just going out and having fun and enjoying the people on the boat.
The most intense that you got were the interments. Because first off, there was a lot involved in it. In those days, there was a certain prestige in winning it. There was a certain prestige in being able to even enter it. And as such, also before the non-kill tournament started to work, there was always a tremendous gallery when you come in from fishing. If you had a fish, everybody was doing it on. You used to bring the fish in. Now, because the entry fees were pretty steep, you wanted your angler to catch a fish. You wanted him to place as high as he could. And in those days, there was always a Calcutta. The high rollers in the tournament would get together and have place bets among themselves. The year that my angler and I won it, my cut was like $2,600 from the Calcutta alone. That's above my regular guide fees and everything. He won a lot of money, and so that was really the most intense part of it, and the fact that tournaments, you had no options. You fished. It don't matter what the weather was. It could be blowing a hurricane. You fished, and my situation was that if you get caught on the water in a squall or a rainstorm or something like that, lightning or whatever, you put your raincoat on and you hunker down and you ride it out. But if you leave the dock in the rain, you're a damn fool. Unless you can run out of it and you see it clear on the other side of it, you're really foolish to leave the dock when it's pouring down rain. Because first off, you can't see, you can't run. The guide can't really navigate as best he should be able to. And there's been some accidents along that line. People pushing the envelope, so to speak. If you don't have a tournament you have to fulfill, there's no reason in the world to leave the dock in a pouring down rain. You can wait 30 minutes or 40 minutes and take 30 minutes or 40 minutes on the other side if you want to.
That's good advice. And I'm going to ask the same question, kind of Hunter asked, but just in a little different way, because I always ask this question when I have somebody on my boat that's fished with a lot of guides, or when I meet somebody like yourself that's guide so long, and that I always ask them, who's the best guide you've ever known, and what makes them that way? What makes them?
Well, the best guide I ever know, and I really truly feel that he is the best guide there ever was, is Steve Huff.
I've heard that name over and over again.
Steve Huff, all I can say is that his I don't know what it is. His attitude, his thoughts on guiding and how he did it. Steve was one of the ones that would leave the dock when it was pouring down rain, and he would come back with a fish. I remember fishing split parties with him where I wouldn't even get in a boat. Steve would get in the boat, come back with you, have a permit or have a jump to tarpon or something like that. First off, all these anglers were very good anglers, very adept. They were good fly fishermen. They were good spin fishermen. They could see. I remember one of Steve's customers who became quite elderly. And Steve told him, he said one year, I used to book him 20 days a year. He says, I can't fish it anymore. And the guy says, why? You can't see anymore. He said, it's futile for you to spend all this money and thing to come down and do it, and it's futile for me to try to get you to do it. And that was Steve's attitude, but he's also a member of the IGFA Hall of Fame. He's 10 years younger than I am, and I think I just heard the other day that he decided to retire. He puts out a newsletter every Christmas, his wife does, and his son's still in the Keys, and a very good angler. I don't know whether he's Steve's caliber, but he's darn close. And Steve and I are good friends. He calls me Rat.
Let me ask you. So, just how we got here in one way was that I was with Fish and Wildlife Game and Fish for 28 years, and I was a game warden in Homosassa when I first started, and I met Jimmy Long then, and I think he was just starting guiding. Yeah. I guess we probably were in Homosassa at the same time.
Oh, we were.
When I retired from law enforcement after 33 years and 28 years with the commission, I wanted to guide. I actually had gotten interested in guiding when I was in Homosassa, but my agency wouldn't let me. So I called maybe 5 I knew the guides. They all kept their cards close to their chest, but I called 5 or 6 people that I knew and said, I'm interested in doing this. Can I ask you some questions? Will you tell me a few things? And Jimmy Long, he actually probably has helped me the most. And he kind of took me under his wing a little bit, and I went down and looked at gear, and he looked at my boat before I got it, and we talked about how customers, in fact, he mentors me today. We had him up in Carabel not long ago, and we were tying tarpon leaders. And, we had everything out and our drills and going through doing the Bimini twist and the Huffnagel. And we were talking about the Slim Beauties and the difference between the two. And he actually showed me a way that you did it a little different. And so I guess I say all that to say that I appreciate you mentoring him. Well, and him in turn mentored me.
Yeah. Like I say, Jimmy and I just hit it off really, really good. He had so much interest in what we were doing, and he needed to have somebody kind of help him along there a little bit. If he wanted to be a guide, he had to get the equipment, everything ready, and the rigging and all the peripherals that go with it. And I was happy to show it to him. There was nothing I did that was a secret. I guess the only secret I ever had was, and I told you about it before, was I used to bring all my fly tying gear to Homosassa, and we put it on the table. Well, at healing beaker time, just before we always go to supper that night, the room used to fill up with people. I mean, there would be other guides and everything, and some of them were just starting out. And Jimmy might be there sometime. Not too much Jimmy, because he was married and had to go home. But some of the other transient guides that were coming in just for the tarpon season. Well, sometimes there would be 7 or 8 people in the room. They were all checking out my fly bench and everything. And my friend Lee Baker and I were roommates in those days. And Lee's wife used to take vitamins. And she used to do it with a hypodermic needle. She would use hypo vitamins. So I had in one of my cases, I had a big patch of porcupine quills. And like I say, everybody was checking out my flies. They were checking out. I'm going to fix these guys. So I tied a fly, started to tie it, and I put these porcupine quills out the back of it. Okay, and then I put these hypodermic needles down underneath it. And I made out like it wasn't quite finished, It was still in the process of being. And I had a little vial of the vitamins that she was taking. I set that there on the table. And everybody started coming in the room that night. Look at that fly. Look around that thing. Finally, one of them says, "Nat, what's are you doing? I said, oh, that's my new secret weapon. He said, what? I said, well, you take these needles, and I said, I've got a customer that comes from South America. And I said, he has access to curare poison. And I said, this is a vial of curare poison. And I said, I take these things and I inject these porcupine quills with curare. And I said, when the tarpon bites the fly, the curare spits out and it kills it right away. And I said, you just line the fish right in. Well, nobody said anything.
And it's fun to hear that because you can tell you had a lot of fun.
Oh yeah, and everybody was hurting. I wasn't trying to hide anything. So everybody, nobody made any comments about it. Finally, one guy came over. Where can I get some of that curare?
But one of the things I love about just kind of hearing some of your stories is just the amount of fun you had with it. And there's definitely, you were talking about tournaments and seriousness, but it seems to me like you talked about, hey, when I have someone on my boat, I'm an entertainer. I want them to have fun. And then I can tell you lived that out as well. And just kind of two things as we wrap up. One is, the first question would be, what types of things do you want to see passed along to the next generation of guides? And then the second thing would be, on this podcast, who would you want to hear from as we continue to interview?
Well, I would think it would behoove you to, if you get a shot at Flip, to get him if you can. He's very active. Bob Stearns would be one too. Bob is he's my age, and Bob's a little stove up now. He's got arthritis pretty bad, but I guess Dale Perez would be one you might get him. He and Harry are very good friends. They both came in to Tampa. I don't remember exactly when Harry started in the Keys, but I remember he used to fish offshore. He was one of the mates on one of the boats offshore. And he just got into the flats fishing, kind of as a kind of a sideline. And Dale Perez, he came in with the idea of being a flats guide. And poor Dale, I remember we took him out. Another guy and I took him out in the backcountry out of Marathon to show him some of the tricks, and he had never poled a boat very much, and we said, "Here, get up on the tower and pole it," Well, poor Dale, he poled around in circles. I mean, he learned real quick, but when he first started out, he was poling around in circles. And I remember he had just moved into the Keys, and on the way back, he lost his wallet overboard, and all his money and everything, all his moving money, and that he had come. It was a bad time, Harry and Tommy Basiglio, who was another one of the Tampa boys. They all used to fish on the bridges there. And Harry got into the boat building business long after he was a guide. He'd been a guide for a long time before he started getting into the boat business. But Harry and I have had lots of good times together, and I remember when he got married.
We had such a great time sitting down with him, and it was a lot of fun. And then when you think about, and this is something I even talked to Harry about, the next generation of guides. What
the next generation of the guides? I retired in 4. And so I've really been out of it for quite some time. And I don't know exactly what they're having to contend with. I know the Keys are loading up. They're loading up with not only permanent guides, but a lot of the freshwater guides from the west are coming in and hanging out shingles and fishing the season down here, which is their off season, quite frequently out there. Some are good, some are not so good, and now to take a young fella who's never started, he has to contend with, first off, the old timers, the part timers, and whatever other new people that are coming in at the same time. All these people tend to take up space on the flats. So what used to be great flats are no longer the great flats. What used to be sure things are not so much sure things. The initial cost has got to be very, very high and taken into consideration. The consensus of the expense of the boats anymore, plus the motors, plus all the peripheral equipment that you need, the licensing that, whereas we had it some to extent down there, it's not near as bad as it is now. When I was going through, I had my Coast Guard license, and I had my occupational license, and that I didn't need anything else. Later on, I had to get one for the Everglades Park, but that was just a catch report. But from what I understand, the guys now got stacks of stuff that they got licensing for, for catching ballyhoo. So, I would say that it would be tenuous to start out as a young man right now and make a successful living with all the expenses that he would have. Where could he fish enough, and with the disbursement of the anglers' bail, how many anglers are out there that are already associated with somebody else? How many new people could he expect to get, and make enough to pay for his expenditures? So I would like to see him succeed, but I would think it would be very tough for him. Their endeavors would have to be, or legion. They can be really good guides, really bad guides, and you get the whole spectrum. When I got out in 4, every tarpon point in the Keys, every track, every place that a tarpon swam by on a migratory path had a boat there. Everyone, not just occasionally, but everyone. Some had 3, some had 5. Now a young guy starting out has got to contend with that. Some of the guys say, "Well, come on in, you can back me up." But when you got 5 guys in front of you casting in the school, by the time they get to you, they ain't gonna be eating very much. So his ability to produce is going to be markedly lower than it was when I started. And when I started, I only had to contend with 5 or 6 people. And then some of them not very often, because weren't always all of us always booked. So you could go anywhere you wanted. If there was a boat there, you had 5 other places to go.
Well, we've loved sitting down with you and getting to hear some of the stories, and we appreciate the time. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast, and excited just to...
I wish I could tell you something.
Yeah, come on, tell us.
I don't know.
You shared a lot. It's been informative. I think just going through my mind sitting here is we should have scheduled more than one podcast. I mean, I had all kind of questions. You know, we want to watch the time and we value your time, but I had questions about the trolling motor switch, and I got all kind of questions for you, but we'll get back to them.
Look, come again. I'll be happy to talk to you. Anytime you want to. What am I doing? I'm sitting here reading.
You gonna come up there and go fishing with me?
Well,
I would love that.
That's a thought too. I tell you, I'm getting stove up anymore. My arthritis is starting to talk to me. You see that damn finger there?
Oh yeah.
And it just things don't work like they used to. I don't know why that is. I'm really amazed.
You're doing pretty good for 82 now.
Well, thank you.
And thank you so much for the time. We'll definitely sit down and dive a little bit more into some of the details.
If you do want to, if you have any more things you want to talk about, I'd be happy to take care of it. I haven't even told you any of my stories.
Well, we can't wait. We'll definitely do part 2. And thank you so much for your time today.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Captain's Collective. The Captain's Collective is also a part of the Waypoint Collective, which features all sorts of great podcasts, television shows, and articles. To find out more, head to outdoors.waypointtv.com. You can check out lots of great content there. We hope you enjoy. Till next time, this is the Captain's Collective.